describes the sentence which he has decided to hand down. No doubt a long custodial sentence. Potentially the prosecution have been asking for a whole life order, but we will find out what the judge says very soon. But we've also been talking about, again, themes that will continue after today, and one is how this could have happened, how Lucy Letby was able to offend, and crucially how, when colleagues of hers, senior medical colleagues, consultants who raised concerns, found themselves not being listened to. Dr. Malcolm Stewart is with us, a retired medical director and regional medical advisor. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. This is something, no doubt, which will be covered by the independent inquiry which has already been announced. What do you think needs to be looked at to try and make sure that this kind of thing can't happen again in a current medical setting?
Well, good afternoon, and can I extend my deepest sympathies to the families of the bereaved, for whom this must be even more upsetting now. I think in answer to your question, the first thing I'd say is there's some key questions that undoubtedly the inquiry will want to ask. These are probably 5 in all. Did the Trust have a policy for raising clinical concerns, and was it followed? Was it fit for purpose, and did it report to board? Were the adverse and unexpected outcomes that we've heard about presented, discussed, with learning points identified and actions logged at the relevant death and complications meetings, which would be the perinatal mortality and neonatal mortality meetings in this case, and again, were these upwardly reported? Did a member of board attend or chair the Clinical Governance and Patient Safety Committee in the Trust? What actions did the medical director and the director of nursing take when concerns were brought to themselves? How escalated and to whom? And finally, how did they assure themselves and the board that the necessary systems of clinical governance, and these are the systems that assure patient safety, that these were in place and crucially were effective? And in my experience, in each of the trusts in difficulty that I visited, each trust would have claimed to have such systems, but what they did not have were effective systems.
To what extent are guidelines and processes like this decided centrally, and to what extent are they up to the individual trusts?
Well, accountability rests at every single level in the health services. It rests with all members of staff, but ultimately with the board, and in particular with the non-execs who hold the executive directors to account for the delivery of their statutory obligations in regard to patient safety. What we're looking at here is not, I think, that there were inadequate central mechanisms, but that some of the systems of clinical governance identified concerns, but these were not adequately followed through. And this is a common theme in these cases of clinical failure. There are ways we can improve.
Do you think we will see?
There are ways.
Apologies, please carry on.
Not at all. The first would be ensure that there's a non-executive director sitting on or chairing the principal clinical governance committee in the trust, to which these concerns should have come, and that would mean that you did not have a situation where the chairman of the board, for instance, could say the board was not cited. Non-executive scrutiny of clinical practice would be much stronger if at least one of the non-executive directors had a clinical background. And thirdly, I think that the regular external review by whichever agency, and there are not many and fewer would be good, that take place for each trust, if greater scrutiny will be placed on whether the governance systems in a trust are effective rather than just in place.
Dr. Malcolm Stewart, thank you ever so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Retired medical director, talking about some of those further themes that will be explored both in the independent inquiry into Lucy Letby's offending, and which no doubt have been looked at by hospital trusts up and down the country as a result of this, as they no doubt review their own procedures in the wake of this distressing and harrowing case. Now, I just want to tell you what's going to come up in the next few minutes, because the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, has indicated that he would begin his sentencing remarks at 12:30. Many people are back in the court now. There are 2 dock officers in the dock, but again, Lucy Letby, as expected, is not there. She is not in the dock in court number 7 to hear the sentencing remarks that will be passed, in the same way that she was not in the dock to hear the victim impact statements this morning, and she was not in the dock at the conclusion of her trial to hear those final verdicts that were passed down at the end of last week. Now, you will be able to see and watch those sentencing remarks here on BBC News. This is something quite new because, of course, for many years there were not cameras in courtrooms, but it is something that is being tried now in a small way, where certain court cases, certain trials, we do get to see the inner workings of the courtroom. And in this case, for this trial, it was decided that the judge's statements, his remarks, his sentencing remarks and his statements would be broadcast. So I just want to explain to you how this is going to happen and what you're going to see, because you will see on your screen the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, and his sentencing remarks will be delivered in several parts. First of all, he will sum up this case. He will talk about some of the detail of Lucy Letby and about Lucy Letby's crimes. Then there will be a central section where he will talk individually, in detail, about the babies who Lucy Letby either murdered or attempted to murder. Now, this is when it might look a little bit different on your screen, because as you may have noticed throughout the reporting of this trial, we haven't been using, the whole media hasn't been using the names of the babies, the names of their parents. They have been protected, anonymised as a whole, in order to protect their privacy as they go through this incredibly difficult time, and also to protect the privacy perhaps of surviving siblings or some of those babies who Lucy Letby attempted to murder. So what you will see in that central section, the moments at which the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, names those babies or names their families, you will see in those cases the picture of him on your screen. You will see it cut to black, and it will reappear again once he has said those names, which he will read out in open court. But again, just to preserve the anonymity of those babies and their families, that is something that you will not see and hear on your screen for that brief period. So just to explain what that will look like. And then he will move into the third part of his sentencing remarks, and this is where he will pass sentence against Lucy Letby. Now, there are a few different things that he will have in mind at this point. There are sentencing guidelines which apply to judges and magistrates across the country, and he will tell us what sentence he's passed. So let's hear now the opening part of those sentencing remarks from the judge, Mr. Justice Goss. We can see him, but we haven't got him speaking just yet. So I will just continue to explain to you while we wait for him to begin his remarks what it is you will see. I was just explaining what will happen in the third part. So the first part will be him summing up the facts and the details of the case. The second part, where, as I was explaining, you will see him appear and sometimes disappear from vision, is when he is talking about the individual babies and families and naming them. And then the third part will be when he actually hands down his sentence. Now, I was telling you there about sentencing guidelines. Of course, murders in this country have a mandatory life sentence, so there are certain parameters that he has to work within. We know that the prosecution have asked for a whole life order, and in the third part, Mr. Justice Goss will explain the sentence that he has decided to convey on Lucy Letby, and he will explain the reasoning for that as well. And this, as I say, because of a part of what is quite a new initiative, you will be able to see and you will be able to hear those sentencing remarks. You can see him in court there, court number 7. Let's hear what Mr. Justice Goss has to say.
Refused to attend court for this sentence hearing. Accordingly, I have to sentence her in her absence. I shall deliver the sentencing remarks as if she was present to hear them, and I direct that she is provided with a transcript of my remarks and copies of the victim personal statements read to the court. Lucy Letby, over a period of almost 13 months between June 2015 and June 2016, when in your mid-20s and employed as a neonatal nurse in the Countess of Chester Hospital in Chester, with specialist training in intensive care, you murdered 7 babies, and attempted to murder 6 others. In the case of one of them, trying on separate occasions 2 weeks apart to murder her. You are now to be sentenced for your crimes. I order payment of the statutory surcharge in the appropriate amount. You acted in a way that was completely contrary to the normal human instincts of nurturing and caring for babies, and in gross breach of the trust that all citizens place in those who work in the medical and caring professions. The babies you harmed were born prematurely, and some were at risk of not surviving. But in each case, you deliberately harmed them, intending to kill them. In your evidence, you said that hurting a baby is completely against everything that being a nurse is, as indeed it should be. You also claimed you never did anything that was meant to hurt a baby, and only ever did your best to care for them. That was but one of the many lies you were found to have told in this case. There is no doubt that you are intelligent and outwardly were a very conscientious, hard-working, knowledgeable, confident and professional nurse, which enabled you repeatedly to harm babies on the unit without arousing suspicion for some time. You prided yourself in your competence. Your fellow neonatal nurses spoke very highly of you, and several of them became your close friends. Having started as a Band 5 nurse at the Countess of Chester in 2012, you became a mentor to student nurses, and in the spring of 2015 gained the qualification that enabled you to care for the sickest babies on the unit, or those requiring the most intensive care. You relished being in the intensive care nursery. Your messages to colleagues revealed an interest in babies that were on or were coming to the unit who had uncommon medical conditions. The methods you employed to carry out your murderous intent were only revealed by the later detailed investigation into the events of and surrounding the collapses and deaths of the babies, which commenced in 2018. There was premeditation, calculation, and cunning in your actions. You specifically targeted twins, and latterly triplets. Some babies were healthy, others had medical issues of which you were aware. The great majority of your victims suffered acute pain as a result of what you did to them. They all fought for survival. Some, sadly, struggled in vain and died. You used a number of different ways to try to kill them, thereby misleading clinicians into believing the collapses had or might have had a natural cause or were a consequence of a developing medical condition. You took opportunities to harm babies when staff were in breaks or away from babies. On some occasions, you falsified records to indicate there were signs of a deterioration before a collapse occurred. You knew that the last thing anyone working in the unit would or did think was that someone caring for the babies was deliberately harming them. As the number of unexpected and unexplained collapses and deaths escalated, senior doctors started to think the unthinkable and consider the possibility that someone was, in fact, deliberately harming the babies, and you were identified as the common factor. You had a detached enthusiasm for the resuscitations and what followed. You endeavoured to impress colleagues and clinicians and sought reassurance from them as to your competence and skills. and would message others to the effect that no one was at fault. On occasions, you cruelly and callously made inappropriate remarks to some of the grieving parents at the time of or in the immediate aftermath of a death. When the homes of both you and your parents were searched, confidential documents relating to babies, including handover and resuscitation sheets and notes and blood gas readings, were found, and there were entries in a diary recording relevant events. Handover sheets relating to all but the first 4 of the babies had been taken from the unit and kept by you. I am satisfied you started to keep these documents after those initial offences in June 2015 as morbid records of the dreadful events surrounding the collapses of your victims and what you had done to them. You had a fascination with the babies and their families, which extended to making repeated searches on Facebook for their parents, sometimes immediately following the events, and on occasions much later. A piece of paper with dent writing on both sides, setting out your thoughts and feelings, was found in the first search of your home in 2018. Amongst the phrases you wrote were, "The world is better off without me," and "I am evil, I did this." The impact of your crimes has been immense, as disclosed by the deeply moving personal statements that have been read to the court this morning. The lives of newborn or relatively newborn babies were ended almost as soon as they began, and lifelong harm has been caused, all in horrific circumstances. Loving parents have been robbed of their cherished children, and others have to live with the physical and mental consequences of your actions. Siblings have been deprived of brothers and sisters. You have caused deep psychological trauma, brought enduring grief and feelings of guilt, caused strains in relationships and disruption to the lives of all the families of all your victims. It is no part of my function to reach conclusions as to the underlying reason or reasons for your actions, nor could I, for they are known only to you. I must pass appropriate sentences according to law, addressing the seriousness of your offences, the facts of which I now describe briefly.
So just to explain the blank tile you saw on your screen there, what Mr. Justice Goss is doing in this part of the sentencing hearing is, you heard him describe there the facts of the case. You heard him talk about the way that she targeted the parents. You heard him describe the really premeditated way in which she murdered or attempted to murder these babies and the pain that each of them suffered. What he's doing now is laying out in the case of each baby, and the reason that you're not seeing and hearing him right now is because he is naming those babies, which is something that of course we're not doing as a media in the reporting of this case, in order to preserve the privacy of those victims and of those families. So for the next part of the sentencing hearing, you will hear some parts of it, and you will then sort of have these moments where he is addressing the court, where he is talking particularly about the babies, where he is naming them, where he is speaking directly to the parents, where he is also naming the parents and really describing the very specific incidences of each child's death. Now, this is something that has been heard as well through the evidential stage of this case, because of course bear in mind that this was a trial that lasted nearly 10 months, and the deaths, the murders and attempted murders of each of these babies have been described really in the most minute level of detail already during this trial, of the way that often these babies were seen to be doing quite well. And we've seen that reflected in some of the victim impact statements this morning as well. The parents of one of the babies who'd been born prematurely, who'd been very sick, talked about at one point they were told that their child might be about to come home. They described sitting with the baby on their knee. They talked about even being told at at one point to bring in the car seat to be checked because the baby may be home within a few days. And then of course it never happened because that was one of the babies that Lucy Letby murdered. So each of those specific incidences is now being described by Mr. Justice Goss in detail. When he's not identifying those babies, we will take you to that camera in the court and you'll be able to hear his continuing remarks like this.
You messaged a colleague saying you needed to throw yourself back in and take an ITU baby soon. On that night shift of the 13th, 14th of June, you were the designated nurse for 2 babies.
Sentencing head on now. Some of the remarks so far say we are illegal because
So again, at this point, Mr. Justice Goss is naming those babies, naming their parents, and as you can hear, he is describing what happened on each occasion when Lucy Letby either murdered or attempted to murder these babies. And one of the things that he talked about in the first part of his sentencing remarks there was the pain that each of these babies suffered. That he was saying, you know, the methods that Lucy Letby used, where she injected, in some cases, air into the bloodstream of these babies, where she uses insulin to poison others, in some cases where she overfed them with liquid food, with milk, or with saline. All of these methods that he described, these methods that she used to kill or try to kill these babies, inflicted extreme suffering and pain on these children, but also on their parents as well, as we've been hearing from the victim impact statements that have been delivered in court this morning, where the parents have really had to relive the most distressing and harrowing of moments, where they talked about their children being in severe distress.
You decided to kill her and administered air into her intravenously, causing her to die from air embolus. You were involved in her resuscitation.
So just to explain to you again why this particular part of the sentencing remarks, you're hearing sort of small excerpts of it and then the camera is cutting away, and that is because, just to keep reminding you, Mr. Justice Goss at this stage is addressing each one of those murders and attempted murders, and in doing that, because of course while we watch this, while we listen to these details, at the heart of all of this are the families of those babies who Lucy Letby murdered and attempted to murder, and this part in many ways is for them the acknowledgement of their children by name, the acknowledgement of the families by name, an absolutely vital part of this sentencing hearing, particularly when this morning the judge heard a victim impact statement from each of them, really heard them describe what they went through during this process. So this part of the sentencing is really important because they're seeing their children named and acknowledged. They are hearing the specific details of their deaths described by the judge once again, and that is why this part is so important to them. And we will listen to the bits that we can listen to and the bits that we can't bring you because of the identifying details. That is why we are cutting away. Let's go back to the judge again.
You sought to reassure her. The circumstances of the attempted resuscitation and his death were harrowing, with profuse bleeding. At the time, the clinicians thought he may have died of necrotizing enterocolitis, and no post-mortem was undertaken. You commented in messages to colleagues that he had a massive hemorrhage, and it could have happened to anyone. On the following night shift, the 4th to 5th of
So what you're hearing just now is the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, explaining in detail about the circumstances of the murder and attempted murder of each of these babies. And we brought you a little earlier on BBC News, we were talking about this sentencing hearing and explaining about the victim impact statements that had been made by each of those babies' families. And just to keep reminding you, when we talk about those babies and when you see those babies referred to in the media, they're not talked about by name. They're deliberately typically referred to by letter, baby A, baby B, baby C. We hear a little more detail about them. In some cases, they were twins. In one case, triplets targeted by Lucy Letby. And the judge is describing the methods in which the nurse used to try and kill, and in some cases to successfully murder those premature babies on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Now, this is all very important in the context of the sentencing hearing, which is what we're listening to now. Lucy Letby is not in the dock to hear any of this. She has chosen to stay in the holding cells here at Manchester Crown Court. But the judge is addressing not just the wider world on television, those remarks which are being televised. He is also addressing the jurors who have spent so long deliberating on this case. He is addressing, of course, the families themselves by name, which is again why we're not showing you this particular part of the sentencing hearing. He is talking to, in some cases, Lucy Letby's colleagues, people who worked with her closely, people who considered her as a friend, and people who were also there on the unit as she was murdering these babies, who also had to live through the experience of seeing these, in some cases, seemingly healthy babies have these catastrophic collapses and die in, as the judge has been describing, painful and difficult circumstances. Let's go back to the court and continue the sentencing remarks.
By the 13th of August, she was stable and was transferred to the Countess of Chester, where the general trend of improvement continued. The 7th of September was her 100th day of life. Nurses had planned a small celebration, including the display of a banner. On the night shift of the 6th to 7th, you delivered.
So you're listening now to Mr. Justice Goss. He is the judge in this case in court number 7 at Manchester Crown Court. And as I am explaining to you, I want to make sure that we can hear as much of this as possible, which is why we keep taking you to the court and then back outside the court again, because of course, as he's naming the babies and naming the families, those are parts of the sentencing remarks that we can't bring you. But I want to make sure, I really want to make sure you can hear as much of this as possible, the parts that we can broadcast where he's talking about the circumstances of the deaths of those babies, because this really all builds up a picture ahead of the sentence which the judge will pass as part of these remarks. You heard him at the beginning just a few minutes ago, and he was talking about the wider circumstances of this case. He was talking about Lucy Letby as somebody who was, on the face of it, a conscientious nurse, a kind person, somebody who went undetected for so long because people believed that she was doing good. And then this pattern of deaths emerged, this pattern of babies having these sudden, sometimes inexplicable collapses. And then, of course, the investigative process that led everything towards the presence of a single nurse at all of those incidents, Lucy Letby, the person who was always on shift when babies were dying or when babies were having these sudden and acute medical episodes. Now, all of this is particularly relevant as part of these sentencing remarks, because what the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, is doing now is he is laying out really all of the facts of the case on which he is basing his sentences. Now, this is something that Lucy Letby or any convicted criminal would normally be in court for. They would normally be in the dock, and these remarks would normally be addressed directly to them. But as I've been reminding you, Lucy Letby is not in court today, but we can continue to hear those sentencing remarks. Let's go back inside court number 7
episodes. Now. On the 30th of September, you infused a large quantity of air down her nasogastric tube into her stomach and bowel, thereby interfering with her breathing, reducing her oxygen saturations and heart rate, and causing her to vomit and require oxygen under pressure. It is also likely that in the early hours of the 13th of October, you infused air into her venous system. The following night, she collapsed again, but recovered with breathing support and was transferred to Arrow Park for 2 days. 6 days after her return, on the night of the 22nd to 23rd of October, she suffered her final collapse, crying out in severe pain as a result of air embolus after you had injected air into her venous system.
I will just bring you back outside Manchester Crown Court once again. You're listening to the sentencing remarks for Lucy Letby. This is the judge, Mr. Justice Goss. He has been talking about all of the details of this case, which of course we brought you first on Friday, that Lucy Letby, a 33-year-old nurse, was convicted of the murders of 7 babies in her care and the attempted murders of 6 more. And what you're listening to and what you're watching on your screens is the picture inside court number 7 here at Manchester Crown Court, where the judge in this case, Mr. Justice Goss, who has presided over a trial of nearly 10 months in length, he is explaining now, he is recapping in many ways the facts of this case, and he is really setting the scene for the sentence that he is about to pass on Lucy Letby. She is not in the dock in court to hear that sentence, but all of this is a very important part of really him explaining when he tells us what that custodial sentence, and it will be a long custodial sentence. If the prosecution has its way, it will be a whole life order where Lucy Letby will never be released from prison. These are decisions that the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, is making, and he is really now explaining both to the court and of course to the wider world, because these are televised sentencing remarks, as you can see. He is explaining really the basis on which he has decided to formulate the particular sentence that he will hand down. Now, what is happening at the moment, this is the central section, really, the middle part of 3 of this sentencing hearing. At the beginning, you heard him talk about the facts of the case, talk about Lucy Letby and the way in which she coldly and calculatedly murdered these children, the way in which she managed to hide that offending, and all of that will no doubt be, designed to highlight the serious nature of the crimes in which she has committed, and all of that will really feed in to the sentence which he will pass in the final part of these sentencing remarks, the central section that you're hearing now. And the reason that we keep bringing you away from the courtroom is just so that we don't broadcast the names and the identities of the families who are in there now, who are listening to everything the judge had to say. Let me just bring in my colleague, Lucy Gray, who has also been here in Manchester during this trial. And Lucy, part of this is really about the families. They are at the centre of everything, and what we're hearing now and what we're watching and what we're listening to, this is really vital for them, because this is the moment at which they will find out finally what sort of punitive sentence Lucy Letby will face for the murders and attempted murders of their children.
Yeah, exactly. They've been waiting 10 months for this. Well, a lot longer. Obviously, the trial has gone on for 10 months, and it's been so impactful, hasn't it? Hearing those statements from the families today, talking about how they raise suspicions, how they search for answers, and these distressing testimony that they've been giving earlier in court today, talking about how perhaps they weren't believed in their search for answers, and several of them talking about how they thought about ending their own lives. Such was the impact on them, and saying, of course, how they'll never recover. Obviously, we've talked also today, haven't we, about how the anger there is that a lot of them have for the fact that Lucy Letby isn't in court to hear this. She's not in the dock. We obviously know she arrived there in Manchester today, but she's not hearing these remarks. And for a lot of them, that is going to be very hard to come to terms with. I think also they found it very hard seeing her for those 14 days when she was giving evidence. We heard the police interviews afterwards also, of course, talking about how emotionless she was when she talked about these babies. They talked about how other members of the neonatal unit, other staff members there, had been very broken when they talked about the events that had happened, the distress that they'd felt because of these babies dying in a unit where they were working, and yet they didn't get that sense from Lucy Letby. So yeah, this is the end of a 10-month trial. This has been going on, a police investigation that's been going on for many years. 32,000 pages of evidence that the police brought to court, and of course now what we're having is the judge going through the details of every single baby that was affected, those 7 that were murdered and the others that we've been hearing about throughout this time. He's going through in the minute detail, and as you're saying, the reason why we're not hearing from him now is because he's giving the details that we have to keep them anonymous for their protection. This is to protect the identities of the parents, but also of the surviving siblings. And such strong comments from the judge already, talking about how the babies suffered acute pain. He talked about them fighting for survival. His words have been so strong. He also talked about those notes that they found at Lucy Letby's house. They found handover notes from medical notes from the hospital. And I'll hand you back now because I believe we're having to hear more from court. Sorry.
Of your
let's go
actions
back into
were truly horrific. After these last collapses and deaths, you were suspended from nursing duties, but pursued complaints of being treated unfairly. When your home was later searched, as well as your 2016 diary, which contained references to long days on the 23rd, 24th and 25th of June, and to J, E and M, respectively, there were handover sheets over that period with resuscitation notes written on the back. All, I have no doubt, being records that you kept to remind you of the details of the consequences of what you had done to those children. For the offence of murder, the sentence is fixed by law and is imprisonment for life. You are now 33 years of age and were over 21 when you committed the offences. Pursuant to the relevant prevailing statutory regime, by having regard to Schedule 21 to the Criminal Justice Act 2003, I have to determine whether the seriousness of the offences of murder, individually or in combination, is so exceptionally high that I should not make a minimum term order and you should spend the rest of your life in prison. For offences of attempted murder, whole life sentences of imprisonment are reserved for wholly exceptional cases. Over a period of just under 13 months, you killed 7 fragile babies and attempted to kill 6 others. Some of your victims were only a day or a few days old. All were extremely vulnerable. They were in a hospital where others were striving to provide them with dedicated medical and nursing care. By their nature and number, such murders and attempted murders by a neonatal nurse entrusted to care for them are offences of very exceptional seriousness. The damaging impact of your actions on others working at that hospital, including those who numbered you as a friend, betraying their trust and creating upset and suspicion, as well as eroding confidence in clinicians and nurses generally, aggravates their seriousness. This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
And that is the scene inside court number 7 here at Manchester Crown Court. You were watching there the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, delivering his sentencing remarks, passing sentence on Lucy Letby, the nurse who murdered 7 babies in her care and attempted to murder 6 more. And as you heard there, the judge has handed down the most serious and comprehensive statement available to him. He was saying that, of course, the crime of murder carries a mandatory life sentence in law, but he has decided on each of those convictions that Lucy Letby will serve a whole life sentence. That means that, as he was saying there, the early release provisions will not apply. It means, in simple terms, that Lucy Letby, 33 years of age, will spend the rest of her life in prison. Now, what you couldn't see, of course, there, the camera trained very firmly on the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, but as he delivered those remarks, there was silence in court. Many of the families who were gathered in the public gallery watching those sentencing remarks being delivered were crying as they heard Mr. Justice Goss speak. This, for them, is the culmination of a process, a trial process which has lasted almost 10 months, but of course a process, an ordeal which began in 2015 and 2016 for some of them, the birth of their premature babies, the death of those babies, and then discovering that one of the nurses who was supposed to be caring for them when they were at their most vulnerable, most fragile, as the judge described, Lucy Letby, was ultimately responsible for their murder. In the cases of attempted murder, we've heard from some of the parents in court this morning in their victim impact statements that those children that Lucy Letby tried to kill but was not successful in doing so, the way that their lives have been affected and impacted in those subsequent years. We heard about children for who their quality of life now is next to nothing. We heard the mother of one of the children who has life-limiting injuries as a result of Lucy Letby's murder attempt. The mother only now gets 2 hours sleep a night. We heard of parents of those children now who, when those children are in hospital for their continuing medical requirements, that parents feel that they cannot leave them alone in the care of medical staff, because this is something that the parents have been living with for so many years. So whole life orders in the case of Lucy Letby for all of the crimes that she has been convicted of. Let's speak to Steve Bryan MP, who is the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, listening to that sentence. First of all, before we move on to some of the wider issues that have been raised by this case, what's your reaction to that sentencing of Lucy Letby, who will spend, we now know, the rest of her life in prison?
I just watched it on BBC News with my children, and you know, it's just heartbreaking. And I think the reaction of most people in the country will be 7 life sentences, spend the rest of your life in prison. Will be it's not enough. And that'll be the human reaction to this. This whole thing is a tragedy. First and foremost, it's a tragedy for the families whose children are either severely damaged or will not grow to be the children that mine are today. But it's a tragedy for everybody concerned. It's just a waste of life all round. And I said yesterday on the BBC, and I repeat it today, I think the ramifications of this for society and for the health system will be very, very long-reaching. And just my other final initial reaction is, I think many people in the country will share, is I think it's an absolute disgrace that she wasn't there to face up to what she's done. And we will, I hope, change the law to make sure that defendants hear exactly what's said to them, whether that be through the use of technology or whether that be in the dock in person. And we have to find a way that they don't exert control over the sentencing process and make it all about them, but they should face what they've done. And it is a disgrace that Lucy Letby didn't today.
As we've been really reflecting all morning, trying to bring you as much as possible of those victim impact statements to really put the families of those babies, those children at the heart of all of this, because of course they are the people at the front of mind today. We've talked about Lucy Letby's colleagues, of course, the jury, the many people who've had to sit through all of this evidence. But I think in those victim impact statements, you really got a sense, didn't you, of the way that this impacts their whole lives, that it impacts their memories, perhaps surviving children, surviving siblings. We've talked about it affecting marriages. We've heard from some of those parents describing how they even considered taking their own lives. In the case of one parent, she said that she thought that if she took her own life, she would see her daughter again on the other side. I mean, we really can't spend enough time, I think, and enough focus on those parents and the awful, awful ordeal that they've been through, can we?
Absolutely, and I've heard some of them as I've been out and about this morning, and the families throughout this nightmare of the trial and obviously the years before, I understand from people close to all of this, have just conducted themselves with the most incredible dignity and poise, and wanted to see justice done. It has been today. I as an MP obviously have been aware and involved in baby loss over the years, and was in my local hospital in Winchester just recently talking about how we handle baby loss with parents. And let's remember that these families have been through baby loss, and then they've subsequently found out that that's been at the hands of somebody who did it deliberately. And you can understand, can't you, that must be unbearable to take. And all of the witness statements this morning are piercing in what they say. And I thought it was very, very good. The judge said that he wants to see the transcript of every word he said and every word they said given to the convicted today. The other thing that struck me in listening to his opening remarks is how he said that the convicted relied on the fact that it was so improbable that somebody in her position would do such a thing. And she almost relied on that to get away with it for so long. That's what I think makes people so sad and so angry today, and why the ensuing inquiry into the system is so important now.
Let's talk about that for a moment. In fact, before we do, I want to make the point, and to make it extremely strongly, that these are fortunately very rare cases, and there are, of course, many dedicated, hard-working, compassionate doctors, nurses, medical staff working at hospitals up and down the country. And I think at a moment like this, it's important to acknowledge and remember that. It is also, though, doubtless a moment of nervousness, perhaps for new parents, people who are about to give birth. They will be wondering whether or not the system is safe. What can you say to them?
And so 100% what you just said, that the NHS is full of caring people, and the NHS is a massive organisation, and like society, there are 99.9% of people are good people, and the bad things happen within society and bad things happen within the NHS. The inquiry that now must happen, I think it is, you use the word reflection. So at moments like this, we reflect, and that's fine and that's important. But reflection without action is not worth enough. So there are two things that I think should happen now, and one where I think the select committee that I chair can help. There've been lots of public inquiries, NHS public inquiries over the years. Bristol, Shipman, Clothier inquiry into the Beverley Allen murders, mid-stats twice. A lot of recommendations have been made. It is still the case that some of the recommendations made in Shipman, endorsed in mid-staffs by Sir Robert Francis, have only now just started to be implemented. So I think there is a piece of work to be done to look at those recommendations and to make sure that they have been followed through, and those that they haven't, we need to find out why. And then there's the inquiry itself to really, I think a judge-led inquiry is what is required here, and I do think it should compel witnesses. That's not to say that people who are involved in this, the former chief executive at Chester has said that he will comply fully. Well, that's great, and so he should. But as this goes on, there may be people who don't wish to, and the inquiry needs to be able to reach wherever it wants to go and wherever the families feel it needs to go. And I think the thing that draws those 2 points together, the common thread, is what you alluded to in your question, which is confidence. The public need to be reassured and have confidence in the system. And therefore, the inquiry is absolutely critical in doing that. It could be some time before it gets underway. I understand that police are potentially now investigating other deaths, and therefore it may be a while before it gets underway. But I think Robert Francis made a good point the other day when he said that we should appoint an independent chair now, start looking at terms of reference. Maybe the family could be involved in that process, and then we move forward from there.
And let me just ask you finally, what will you be doing from this point on? Because of course select committees, they have an enormously important role. You are there with cross-party colleagues. You're able to perhaps work together in a way that we don't always see in Parliament. And there are so many things that are going to happen now in terms of inquiries and in terms of further investigations, as we were saying. What are you personally going to be doing to help and assist with that?
So what we won't be doing is stepping on any ongoing police work. Obviously, we won't be duplicating what the inquiry does. But so in terms of an audit, I have something called the expert panel, which advises me, and it looks at promises government have made in various areas of policy. Robert Francis, actually, who chaired the Mid-Staffs inquiry, is on that expert panel, and Professor Jane Dacre chairs it. It is possible that we may, as a committee, and we'll discuss this obviously imminently, may wish to ask them to look at recommendations made by previous inquiries. We have also literally just before summer recess been approached by an MP called Mayor Robertson, who chairs an all-party group around whistleblowing in the NHS, for an inquiry to look into the whole culture around whistleblowing and leadership in the NHS. And I think my members, and as you rightly say, it is a cross-party committee, we will be discussing that ASAP. And I think it is highly possible that we may be looking at whistleblowing in the NHS and its role, because, without wishing to preempt what an inquiry says, you've heard what the former medical director at the Trust has said about them trying to raise alarm at this and ending up having to write apology letters to the convicted Lucy Letby to say sorry for questioning her. Something feels very, very wrong about that. So thank you for saying that. I think select committees are important. They are cross-party. I think they have the confidence of the House of Commons, and we will do our bit, whatever we can do, to help in this awful, awful episode.
Steve Bryan, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining as the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. Thank you for being with us here on BBC News. We're at Manchester Crown Court, bringing you continuing coverage of the sentencing of Lucy Letby, the 33-year-old nurse who has been convicted of murdering 7 babies in her care at the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital and attempting to murder 6 more. Now, just in the last few minutes, the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, has delivered his sentencing remarks. I just want to bring you part of that again.
Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
Mr. Justice Goss there just really explaining once again the sentence that he has handed down to Lucy Letby today here at Manchester Crown Court. As he was explaining there very clearly, she will spend the rest of her life in prison. She did not appear to actually hear those sentencing remarks, or indeed any of the victim impact statements that were delivered, often so emotively, by parents themselves or by counsel in court this morning. And we're already receiving some reaction to that sentencing on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service. Their senior Crown Prosecutor, Pascal Jones, says today's sentence means that Letby will never again be able to inflict the suffering she did while working as a neonatal nurse. She's rightly been brought to justice by the courts. My thoughts remain with the families of the victims who have demonstrated enormous strength in the face of extraordinary suffering. I hope that the trial has brought answers which has long eluded them. That's Pascal Jones from the Crown Prosecution Service. Also, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk MP, he has tweeted to say Lucy Letby is not just a murderer, but a coward whose failure to face her victims' families, refusing to hear their impact statements and society's condemnation is the final insult. We are looking to change the law so offenders can be compelled to attend sentencing hearings. My colleague Lucy Gray has also spent time here in Manchester following this case. And I think it was always going to be the case, wasn't it, Lucy, that when Lucy Letby refused to appear in court for the final verdict and again for sentencing today, that there would be public outrage that she was not there to face these families after they've suffered so much.
Yeah, anger from the families and anger from other people, from organisations across the country. Obviously, they saw the prison van. We've had the images. We've shown the prison van of her arriving there in Manchester at the Crown Court, but not going into the dock. And as we've been hearing also over the past few days, she wasn't in court for some of the verdicts as well. This has been nearly 10 months of this trial. She was in court for 14 days when she gave evidence. So the parents of the babies will have seen her then. And as we heard from some of the victims' statements that were read out in court, the impact statements that were read out in court earlier today, that was traumatic enough in itself for them, having to see this nurse who had seemingly cared for their babies, who was then responsible for their murders or attempted murders, having to see them in court. Clearly very distressing for them. It's been a really emotional day in court, obviously hearing from the families, the public gallery packed with them, people crying, that some of the jurors were there as well. They don't have to be in court today. They were discharged and they didn't need to be there, but some of them clearly wanted to be there to see this sentencing remarks from the judge. And they have been such strong words from Judge Justice Goss today. He talked about, when he said that she had killed 7 babies and attempted to kill 6 others, he talked about how some of them were only a day old or a few days old, and they were all extremely vulnerable. He talked about how the nature and number of these murders and attempted murders are offences of such exceptional seriousness, and that is why he handed down this full life sentence for all of the offences. He talked about a cruel, calculated, cynical campaign of child murder of the smallest and most vulnerable, knowing that she was causing significant suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. He talked also about how she'd shown no remorse and how she had coldly denied